between an author and another person in the field. My name is Annie. I am the events coordinator at Majors and Quinn Booksellers in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And we are very pleased to be hosting another conversation tonight. Today, we're speaking with Ellis Cose, author of The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America. And he'll be in conversation with Professor Ev Dennis. Ev is professor of journalism at the Medill School of Journalism, Northwestern University, and served nearly a decade as dean and CEO of Northwestern's futuristic campus in Doha, Qatar. An author, educator, and institution builder, he was founding director of the Gannett Freedom Forum Media Studies Center at Columbia University, founding president of the American Academy in Berlin, and dean of the School of Journalism and Communication at the University of Oregon. He also received his PhD here at the University of Minnesota. And so we're very much looking forward to hearing the questions that he has for Ellis and his book. So I just want to remind you that the book is available on majorsandquinn.com. I will drop the link to that book into the comments here. And speaking of the comments, that is where you should put any questions you have for Ellis or Ev during this presentation. We will take audience questions at the end, and we very much look forward to hearing your questions. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ev to get this conversation started. Thanks very much.
Annie, thank you very much, and thanks to Majors and Quinn for sponsoring this program tonight, a conversation with Ellis Cose about his new book, The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America. It's great to be back in Minneapolis, even if virtually, in a beautiful part of the city, and in a city where freedom of speech had a major victory way back in the 1920s with a famous case called Neer versus Minnesota. Tonight, it's a pleasure to reconnect with my old friend and colleague, Ellis Cose, who has become a very distinguished author from the time that I first met him. He had a legendary, I might say, a storied career in journalism, beginning when he was 19 years old. I think he was the youngest columnist on a daily newspaper in the United States, and that was at the Chicago Sun-Times. He was there for a number of years, in a number of positions. He was at the Detroit Free Press sometime after that. And through his career, he ended up spending some 17 years, I believe, at Newsweek magazine, where he was a columnist and contributing editor, and wrote some very important cover stories during that time. He's continues to write for USA Today. He's been really almost everywhere in media, done radio documentaries about Africa and many other things. But we're here tonight to talk about his latest book, and he's produced a number of books along the way. And I should just remind you that that his books include The Rage of a Privileged Class, The Envy of the World, A Nation of Strangers, a relatively recent one called Democracy We Can Keep It, which is very much related to the book tonight, a book called Colorblind. And I think his first book was a book called The Press that I remember he produced when he was a fellow at the Media Studies Center at Columbia University a while back. Well, Ellis, I'd like to begin tonight by saying welcome, or you can welcome me, or we can welcome each other, I guess. But to ask you about this this book, which has really I might say, a very provocative title, and one that some people will find just a little curious, although the word curious is in it. And that is The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America. Now, a lot of people would say we have the First Amendment. It goes back to almost to the founding of the country. It's part of the Constitution of the United States. People think they have free speech, but you challenge that in this book in a very effective and important way, I think. But tell us just a moment about the origins of the book. What stimulated you to do this? I noticed in the first chapter, you start really with a very contemporary case, that of the Charlottesville marches of the white supremacists. That was about free speech. So free speech is with us all the time and very much in play. It's certainly not a settled matter, but the origins of the book first, and then we'll go on. And one more question after that. And then I'd like, if you would be so kind, if you'd read from the book.
Let me say, it was great to be reunited with you. I've always treasured the time we spent together at Columbia University when you were running the Gannett Center. And you're right, that was the beginning of my book writing career. That was over 20 years ago now. It's been a while. But it's great to be back with you. The origins of this book. One of the positions I held, which you didn't mention, I was the writer in residence at the American Civil Liberties Union.
Mm-hmm.
And I eventually decided to leave the ACLU, in part because I had decided I was going to write a book about the ACLU and didn't think it was a good idea to be within the institution while I was doing a book about the institution. And it's as you said, it's a very a recent book. It just came out 2 months ago. And it's a history of the ACLU from the beginning. And of course, the ACLU was one of the premier organizations involved in the fight for free speech in America. And I got wrapped up in the issue while I was there in a way I hadn't before. And originally thought that there were all these ideas about free speech, its origins, what it meant to America, that could easily be incorporated into a book about the ACLU. And along the way, realized that that was really not possible. The ACLU has such a huge story in and of itself that to tell that story while also telling the ACLU story didn't strike me as possible. Another position you didn't mention, I was a fellow at the University of California Center for Free Speech and Public Engagement. And part of my time spent there was spent writing and delivering a lecture, on free speech and its origins and what it means now. And that lecture grew into this book. And this book is a broad book at free speech and other issues that impinge on and have to do with free speech. And you mentioned the title, which is the first part of the title is The Short Life. And then, of course, The Cure. And I'll hold up the book now so people can see it. But this is the book. Is it framed correctly? Yeah. And we do tend to think of free speech as something that we've had forever. We tend to think that it's something that has always been part of the American experience. And in a sense, that's true. It wasn't, as you know, part of the original Constitution. There was not, the founders weren't convinced we needed a Bill of Rights. I mean, the whole question was, why do we need a particular Bill of Rights to protect us against the nation that we're creating? When they thought of rights that protected them against the English crown. But they ultimately, partly because of the influence of James Madison, decided, well, we probably do need a Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights was a set of amendments, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and that was ratified in 1791. And even though it was ratified in 1791, and we had free speech, which basically spelled out, freedom of the press, freedom of the right to free speech, the freedom of assembly, freedom to petition the government, and freedom of religion, we almost immediately decided that wasn't important. And 7 years after we ratified the First Amendment, along with the other nine amendments, part of the Bill of Rights, we passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which basically made it illegal to speak out against the government, the Federalist government at that time. So you had people who were in prison for speaking out against the government. And that ease with which we abandoned the First Amendment was something that persisted for a long time in our country. We just...
Ellis, that the 19th century, as you point out in the book, was replete with all kinds of the transgressions of free speech and terrible things, including the hanging of a newspaper editor and some other kinds of things along the way. So what was happening that led us up to the 20th century when free speech suddenly is on the docket?
Well, let's go back for a second to the 19th century. One of the reasons why those awful things were allowed to happen, I mean, it was illegal, for instance, to publish literature in most of the South, abolitionist literature advocating the abolition of slavery, and that was because the amendment, as passed and as ratified, spoke not at all to obligations of states. So states weren't bound by the First Amendment at all. So if a state decided that it wanted to pass a law that said you couldn't speak about certain things, that was perfectly fine. And the Constitution was silent on that. It wasn't until the next century, and I'll get to that if you want me to, but it wasn't until the next century that that became part of the rights that were part of the Constitution, basically. So what happened? A lot of things happened, but the biggest thing that happened was World War One.
Right.
In World War One, we had under Wilson, we had a government that that passed the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. Espionage Act in 1917, the Sedition Act the next year, which was actually an amendment to the Espionage Act, which together basically made it illegal to say anything critical about the government. It made it illegal to criticize the war. It made it illegal to try to encourage people to become resistors of the war, or to become conscientious objectors. And as a result, hundreds, thousands, literally, of people were imprisoned for speaking out against the war. I mean, most famously, there was the union, the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, where the Justice Department indicted 166 of its members for what? Well, for being against the war. And I think it's still the biggest trial held at one place at one time. They managed to corral over 100 of those people into one courtroom in Chicago, one federal courtroom in Chicago, and try them all at one time. And the evidence was ridiculous if you look at it now. I mean, they introduced such things as a guy who had visions of Wilson sort of being defeated, and then and things like that, and that became part of his part of the reason for putting people in prison. And you had people who were sentenced to 20 years and substantial fines. Most of them ultimately ended up not serving that, and then the leader of the union, Big Bill Hayes, ended up fleeing to Russia. But it was against the law. You even had things like a guy who made a movie called The Spirit of 76, which he thought was a patriotic movie. It was a movie was based in the Revolutionary War, but he made the mistake of including scenes that showed outrages committed by the English. Well, the English were allies in World War One, so you couldn't really criticize them either. So he received a 10-year sentence for his film. And then in addition to that,
even cartoonists in Masses Magazine cases during that period,
right,
people were jailed for that. Indicted.
They were jailed. I mean, they were indicted. That actually resulted in a hung jury. But you did have all these cases that got tried, and you also had right after, even when the war ended, you had the Red Scare, the first Red Scare. It was in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. You had this huge fear of anarchists. There were the Palmer raids, where they raided people. Essentially for being associated with the socialists or with the Communist Party. And again, they put thousands of people in jail. They deported hundreds of people as well. And out of this tumult grew several human rights organizations, which said, "Hey, wait a minute! Don't we have a Bill of Rights? Don't we have something that should allow people to speak?" And of course, prominent among them was the ACLU, which was founded in 1920 out of this turmoil, actually. And it took a number of cases. The most famous one, probably, well, the most important one, being a 1925 case, Gitlow v. New York, which established, first of all, that even though they lost their case, and this was two guys who published some kind of communist manifesto, they thought in their newspaper, even though they were convicted, the Supreme Court said, "Wait a minute, we think that the Bill of Rights ought to apply to states." So it said they at least had the right to contest this kind of law, even though it was a state law. And gradually through the years, that right got expanded. So when I say the short life of free speech, part of what I'm referring to is that until this century, well, not this century, but until the 20th century, the Bill of Rights didn't really apply. At least that part of the Bill of Rights didn't really apply. And the whole idea that we have a freedom of speech was really a result of movements and decisions made from the 20s going forward.
And shortly after the the Gidlow case came the Whitney case, which I believe it was Justice Brandeis in that case, who added to the lore of what we might think of as a kind of romantic notion of the First Amendment, going back to Milton and Areopagitica, the idea that truth and falsehood grappling in the marketplace, who knew truth not to win out. And I know that that's a theme that you pick up on and debunk somewhat, both from the first chapter, really all the way through the book. And I think that's an important linchpin, presumably, to what you see as free speech under enormous duress these days, if not in great peril.
Oh yeah, and from many directions, and it's interesting. I mean, the case you refer to was a woman from California, right, who decided that to join first the Socialist Party and then the Communist Party, and they had all these laws on the books at the time, which criminal syndication laws at the time, which made it a crime to become a member of the Communist Party. So she was essentially arrested and convicted for belonging to the Communist Party, because it was assumed if you belonged to the Communist Party, you were plotting against the state. And she got convicted under state law, under the state law, and then also on appeal she got convicted. And what's interesting is that the Supreme Court allowed that conviction to stand. But even as they allowed that conviction to stand, Brandeis, as you mentioned, in his concurrence, made this eloquent defense of free speech, and you end up scratching your head when you read it, because you say, okay, if he really believed all this stuff, why is he believe this woman ought to be sent to prison? And that's one of the great mysteries. It's never answered. But within his defense of the right to free speech, he talks about all this stuff you just mentioned, and very chief among them is this idea that only in the conflict of ideas do you have good ideas that crowd out bad ideas, and the idea that untruths cannot stand when confronted with truths. It seems pretty ridiculous when you think about it now, and where our government is now, and how much lying routinely takes place, and how difficult it is for truth to actually emerge. But he's one of the prime.
Or the onslaught of social media, which of course is part of that, as a barrage, a true avalanche of messages constantly, which are lying, incorrect information, personal attacks, many things that are out there, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or whatever.
Well, I think you have a lot of things, and I think that's a key part of it. But I think we have a different kind of culture, and we have a culture that's we learned the lessons of advertising in our culture now. We learn how powerful creating images and ideas, even if they are fictitious, can be. And I think you have a milestone even before Trump became a huge presence on the scene. I mean, you go back a few years to 2004, when you had John Kerry running for the presidency, and he got swift boated. I mean, that's now a verb, which basically they took a guy who was a war hero. He had won the Bronze Star, had saved lives as a soldier in Vietnam. He ultimately turned against the war, but the important thing is that they decided that he was not. They decided they needed to take him down a peg or two. So they got some veterans to consort with, and they made an advertisement. They made a film. They wrote a book. All of which were designed at making him into something that he wasn't. In effect, making him into a coward, making him into almost a war criminal. And that image of him held. It took hold, and it redefined him, and is probably as responsible as anything for him losing his bid to become president at the time. And then, of course, in not too long after that, Donald Trump realized that maybe he could convince people that Barack Obama wasn't an American citizen, and that would be useful. And so he became a major proponent of this so-called birtherism nonsense, where he spread the idea that Barack Obama had who was born in Kenya, as he articulated it, somehow tricked his way into the United States and tricked his way into becoming a candidate for presidency. And despite the fact that he wasn't a natural born U.S. citizen as is required by the Constitution, and Trump was going to send investigators to Hawaii to get to the bottom of this. Well, of course, he never sent investigators anywhere. He knew it was a lie, but he also knew that the lie could gain traction, and it did. So by the time the election came around, a majority of Republicans actually believed that Barack Obama had not been born in this country, and so the idea, that all you need to do is to present truth and lies will fall aside, looks pretty naive at the present time.
Yeah, pretty romantic, and almost an antiquarian thought, in spite of the fact that it has a very rich history. I like very much in the book that you draw so much on the history of freedom of speech and press in the U.S., and then you move on to really the contemporary scene and show how this is relevant even in the era of the pandemic. But before we continue on, could I invite you to read from the book so we get a feeling of your voice in the book itself?
Let me select a segment here. I wasn't quite sure I was going to read, but I will do that, and I'll read from the introduction, which is right from the beginning. And let me just hold up the book again so you're familiar with me. Just try to frame it here. The title of it. This comes from the introduction. No one expected their words to be enlightening or their tone harmonious. Hatred rarely comes in such flavors. It spills out as an ugly, incoherent mess, infused with a rotten odor of willful ignorance. And so it was with the Nazi wannabes, self-styled white supremacists determined to make their mark on the world, committed to convincing anyone who might listen that their superiority was both evident and inevitable. The setting was downtown Charlottesville, Virginia, August 2017. Their mission was unity of like-minded hate-mongers. Their leader, Jason Kessler, was a 33-year-old who lived with his parents and at once supported Barack Obama. He had learned that many demographers thought whites would eventually become a minority in the United States. That news was so unsettling that Kessler made himself into a, quote, white rights activist. It's one thing to have immigration, but to the point where they overwhelm the host population is not right, he said. He styled himself as a civil rights and human rights advocate focused on the Caucasian demographic in the mode of Jesus Christ or Mahatma Gandhi. His Unite the Right rally, observed the Christian Science Monitor, was supposed to be the movement's coming out party and emergence from the shadows of internal chat rooms into the national spotlight. And it goes on from there to talk about how that group that he led wanted to hold this march at what had been Robert E. Lee Park in Virginia, in Charlottesville, and the name had been changed, which they objected to Emancipation Park. They were going to take down a statue of Robert E. Lee, who was, of course, a hero of the Confederacy, which the group also had problems with. And so they were going to have this big march to demonstrate their unhappiness. The city wanted them was okay with them having a march, but wanted them to have a march in a different park, which was not so centrally located and was more easily policed, basically. The ACLU and a local group called the Rutherford Institute came together and said, and they asked them and to defend this group and their right to free speech, which to them meant the right to have a march and a demonstration in the park that they wanted to. And the ACLU won the case, and that march ended up being scheduled. The march never actually took place. What happened the Saturday that the march was to be held was that there was so much violence and so much imminent danger. And Virginia is also an open carry state. So there were people brandishing weapons that the police decided to shut the march down. But despite that, there were 3 deaths. There were 2 policemen who were in a helicopter who were basically assigned to oversee and monitor the march, and their helicopter crashed and they died. And then a young woman was killed when one of the white supremacists plowed into a group of anti-racism protesters with a car, immediately killing her, and also severely injuring 70 some odd other people. And so this caused a great deal of internal questioning within the ACLU, as people basically said, why are we defending people marching around saying Jews will not defeat us, and spouting all other kinds of hateful things? Is this really what defending the First Amendment means? And it became somewhat of an internal crisis for the ACLU.
And Ellis, hasn't that historically been what the ACLU has done? There was the Skokie case some years ago, which was the Nazis and racist marches and that sort of thing, and they seem to be sort of lionized later for having defended even movies about this, having defended the most unpopular speech. So how do we resolve the difference between unpopular speech on the one hand and then criminal action in effect on the other, which has to do with killing people and depriving other people of their rights?
Well, let me just unpack, if I can, for a second, what the ACLU history was in that. The ACLU, from its beginnings, decided that they were going to be a free speech organization, and they're not going to be monitors of the content of speech. So going back actually to the 1930s, when Nazism was on the rise in Europe, the ACLU found itself in the position of defending people who were aligned to the KKK and also to the Nazi movement. And they actually wrote a pamphlet, which they published in the 1930s. The title something like "Why Do We Defend Nazis?" And the answer they came up with in this little pamphlet was why they defended such speech was that in order to be consistent and in order to be defenders of free speech, they could not decide that they were going to be the monitors of what speech was allowed and what speech wasn't allowed, because if they could play that role, government could play that role, or someone else could play that role, and that what speech should be allowed and shouldn't be allowed would depend on a person's personal perspective, and there's no objective way to come at the issue. You mentioned the big march in 1978, or the big march that was planned in 1978, in Skokie. Skokie is a suburb of Chicago. At the time, it housed a lot of Holocaust survivors. And you had this group of Nazis, neo-Nazis, who wanted to march through there and shout what they would shout. The city was, of course, aghast and immediately passed several ordinances that would have made it illegal to march in the way that these marchers wanted to march. And they went to the ACLU, and the ACLU at that point was accustomed to this. They had several big cases of defending such objectionable people and said, of course, we have to defend this. And they did. And it became an iconic moment for them. I mean, it almost destroyed the organization because there was so much public revulsion to what they were doing and so much public criticism and people were threatening to yank their funding, Jews in particular, but lots of other people were deciding they didn't want to be associated with it. And they turned it around. They began to turn it around by having the lead lawyer on that case, a guy named David Goldberger, write a fundraising letter. And in the fundraising letter, he quite simply stated, he said, first of all, I'm Jewish. I don't like these Nazis any more than the rest of you guys do. But why I'm doing this case is that the kind of law they passed here in Skokie is the same kind of laws they're trying to pass in Selma, Alabama, to stop civil rights people from marching. Sure. And I can't be consistent and fight those laws in Selma without also fighting the same kind of law here. And so a lot of people, they said, okay, well, that seems to make sense. Go do it. And it became the most successful fundraising appeal up to the time within the ACLU. And they have, since 1978, pretty much clung to that view, of course, until Charlottesville came along. And then they began to question that, as did a lot of other people, because a lot had changed since 1978. The political landscape had changed. The fact that there was a president in office who seemed to more or less give silent sanction to certain types of unpleasant speech.
Very people, as I recall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also, society had changed a little bit. And the ACLU, if you go back to 1978, it did not have a racial justice function, or a racial justice section, at least. By 3 years ago, it did. And so you had a lot of people within the institution who were saying, we didn't really join this organization because we wanted to defend Nazis and KKK members. We joined this organization because we wanted to fight for an equal society. And ultimately, the organization decided it was not going to abandon what had become a bedrock principle for them. They were not going to make content decisions in who they defended, but they did make it clear that henceforth they were not going to defend people, who were carrying weapons or who looked like they were looking for a violent resolution of their event.
I recall even the great Justice Hugo Black, probably the strongest absolutist defender of free speech, used to say that there were times, I think he had a standard of time, place, and circumstance. But there were instances where free speech indeed could be modified or could be controlled in some way or by local circumstances.
And there's nothing controversial in some sense about that idea. I mean, going back to one of the seminal free speech cases, which was a case in the 1940s, a guy named Chaplinsky, who was a Jehovah's Witness. That case was about him calling a cop names, basically, because the cop would not defend him when he was assaulted by other folks on the street. And I forget the names he called them, but they were names that really wouldn't be considered all that offensive today. But that incident ended up with him arrested and ended up with him convicted of verbally assaulting a cop. And the Supreme Court upheld that, and they upheld it with this doctrine of fighting words. That there were some words that were so objectionable, that were so likely to cause somebody to lose their temper and fight, that they shouldn't be allowed in a civilized society. Now that decision was never overturned, but it's been pretty much ignored, over the last few decades. But it certainly established the idea that there were limits on speech, and that there were limits, and there were also other limits. I mean, there were limits on you can't have child pornography, for instance, because it's just considered something that is so objectionable to our society that we don't want to permit that. The whole idea of screaming, fire in a crowded theater, and so forth and so on. So there have always been limits, and I think the real question becomes, what kind of limits do you place? Who determines what these limits are, and how do you allow free speech with the kinds of limits that society wants to?
One of them that you raise is, of course, the famous case of the New York Times against Sullivan in 1964, which had to do with an advertisement in the New York Times that Heed These Rising Voices, I believe it was called, had to do with African American ministers in the South, and the case itself. But as a result of that case, which eventually was won in the Supreme Court, there was a standard of actual malice, I believe, that had to do with reckless. You could say almost anything as long as there was not reckless disregard or knowing falsehood. But that hasn't saved us from what's gone on later under Mark Zuckerberg, has it?
Well, Zuckerberg used that case to defend his position in terms of allowing advertisements on Facebook, which were knowing lies by the Trump administration. And they were lies of this conspiracy theory nonsense, accusing Biden of things which are demonstrably false. And in any other context where he's not a public figure would have been libel, and clearly so. And what I found offensive was that in his defense of his position, which was, we are not going to screen, we're not going to monitor political advertisements, even if they have lies that are clearly and transparently and willfully lies. We're going to allow them to go unchallenged. What I found offensive was that he used Sullivan v. New York as his defense in that. And he said, well, this goes back to the foundational case, in terms of free speech in America. And then from there, he got everything wrong. I mean, the way that he described Sullivan v. New York, and you said, as you correctly describe it, it was basically revolved around an advertisement taken out by allies of Dr. Martin Luther King, who were trying to raise money for the movement back in 1960. It was a movement, as anyone who knows the history of the time knows, was under severe threat from the state governments at the time. This was a period where people were being beaten, where homes were being blown up, where people were being threatened, and certainly arrested. And so, to illustrate what they were going through, they wrote this ad, which you refer to, mm-hmm. And in it they talked about what the protesters had suffered, the privations they had suffered at the hands of the police. They talked about the numbers of arrests that Dr. Martin Luther King had endured. They talk about the bombings of homes, etc. And they accuse the government of Alabama of waging an outright war against their movement. Well, the police chief and some other officials said, "Wait a minute, they allude to us in this ad, don't they? Isn't this libel?" And we're talking about Alabama in 1960. They had no problem convincing state courts in Alabama that a little black group calling, the state officials, was libelous, and they got a judgment for $500,000 in the state court, which bankrupt essentially there are 4 black ministers who were on this case, and they had to sell their cars, towards the fine, and the objective of the officials also was to silence the New York Times, which they sued because they didn't like the idea that these northern papers were covering the civil rights movement. So this is the case that goes to the Supreme Court. And this is the case, as you say, that the Supreme Court said you need actual malice in order to bring this, in order to prevail on this case. But in Zuckerman's retelling of it, the problems with the case, and the reason that it went ahead in the first place, was because the ministers were were spreading misinformation. Well, first of all, they weren't spreading misinformation. They got a few
tiny errors, I recall.
They got a few facts wrong. They had, Martin Luther King arrested the wrong number of times, and things like that, which were seized on by the government officials. And these were certainly not material errors of any sort. And to use that as a justification for him not monitoring ads was ridiculous. But the larger point, though, and the other point in all of this, is that Facebook is a private entity, and a private entity has the right to monitor what's on its content. They can say we have a community, and the community standard does not allow certain sorts of things, or if you're going to be on the site, you have to agree to be civil. You have to agree to be truthful, or at least to be reasonably truthful, things of that nature. Because he wants, obviously, to continue to profit from such ads, and presumably because he also did not want to offend powerful political interests, Zuckerberg went along with this and tried to wrap himself in the First Amendment, which I considered, an insult, first of all, to the civil rights movement, but also an insult to history, because it was a totally uninformed argument that he made.
So the issue, though, of free speech and social justice, you're saying, doesn't always jive, and yet in order to get social justice, you need a modicum of free speech, but it's the intrusion with the bombardment of error, of misleading information, of actual threats, for that matter, not only by individuals and organizations, companies, et cetera, get involved, but even foreign powers now are playing a role in the flow of information. So you make, I think, a strong case for the risk that free speech is truly at risk these days. You talk about the curious death of free speech because of the individual getting lost in this maelstrom of all these other voices. So if that's the case, what kind of remedies might we find? As the 20,000 errors or lies in the Washington Post cut it in terms of Donald Trump? That's out in the marketplace. People know that. They can like it or not like it. What if any remedies might there be, and are there some examples from other countries that you've looked at?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to make it very clear that I'm not at all an advocate of government censorship.
Sure.
That's immediately where a lot of people go. I mean, I think that the government should have no role in sort of telling people what they can say and or how they should say it, except for in the most extreme circumstances, when they're actually protecting lives and protecting people against some of the sorts of instances that I mentioned previously. So what I don't believe is that we need more government censorship, but I do believe that we need a more responsible citizenry on several levels. I mean, I think that it's nothing wrong with social media collectively deciding that they are going to try to police what happens on their sites better. At a minimum, try to determine that people who are telling blatantly, obviously ridiculous lies ought to be either sanctioned or this material ought to be flagged. In fact, some have already decided to do such a thing, and that is not going to squelch speech. But in another way, I think the problem is just a problem that we're stuck with as a society. And what that means for me is that we need to educate ourselves better. First of all, I mean, there was a interesting study which you oversaw, which you shared with me not too long ago, which I found fascinating. And because if I remember the numbers correctly, 91% of respondents to that study believed in freedom of speech. Right. 89%, as I recall, believed in freedom of the press. But at the same time, you had 29% believing that Trump ought to shut down CNN and the New York Times and other institutions that said that he was critical of. What that says to me at a minimum is that our understanding as a society of what rights we have, what free speech covers, what freedom of the press covers, is not well understood. I would argue that there ought to be a sort of mandatory course for in what used to be called civics, in high school and certainly in college, sort of going through the history of speech in this society and why we consider it important. I would also argue that we are really awful as a collective society. Some of us more awful than others, but we're really awful when it comes to the skill of critical thinking and critical reasoning. Those are skills that can be taught or at least improved. And there was research done by Stanford University where they looked at high school students or looked at college students, and they showed them information online that was easily verifiable. And they and gave them the resources to check it. Most of them didn't. Most of them simply accepted this stuff they saw as true. And in a society where we have now, where you not only have political operatives who are consciously spreading falsehoods, as in the Swift boat incident that I gave earlier, and that has accelerated since that time. But you also have governmental actors, and specifically Russia, but others as well who are getting involved. We need to not only have this stuff monitored better, but we need to be better ourselves at being able to recognize stuff that is apparently not true.
Yeah, whether we call that information literacy or media literacy, it really is important. And as you say, there have been a number of studies that go way back to an old one the ACLU did a long time ago, on the difference between people's belief in freedom of expression in the abstract. Yes, I think I should be able to say anything I want to. The rest of the world should be able to do that. And then you come to a specific case. Do you think this person or this cause should? Oh, no, you don't believe. You don't want to apply there. I wonder if there are any questions that are coming in. I'm not seeing on my screen here. We should open to those if there are any. Otherwise, we can continue for a few minutes.
Yeah, one thing I do want to say is that when I talk about the problem with free speech, it's not just that that there are barriers to free speech, and there are real barriers. When one of those being money. I mean, if you don't have financial resources, your ability to speak politically is much more limited than those who do. And I think one of the profound decisions that affects that and will continue to affect that was the so-called Citizens United decision in 2010, which where the Supreme Court essentially overturned, the McCain-Feingold Election Reform Act, and essentially said you can pour as much private money, as much corporate money as you want to into the political enterprise, because corporations are persons, and as persons, they have as much of a right to speech as you or I do. Even Stevens, Justice Stevens, who dissented on that decision, said it's absurd, to think that that corporations are people in that sense, or that the founders even intended for corporations to be seen as people. And he goes to lengths to make the case that they did not. That back then, to begin with, there were very few corporations, and corporations acted under special charters. So this whole idea, that corporations should be equated with human beings is something that's been cooked up in the modern era. But what it has done is to totally contort political dialogue, and it's clear.
You see the individual getting lost in this institutional swirl, I gather.
Well, absolutely. I mean, a politician is going to pay a lot more attention to someone who's given his or her campaign effort, hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of dollars, than he is going to pay to someone who just can offer a vote, or the withholding of a vote. And we've seen that play out, excuse me, in modern times.
There was the hope that social media would be a corrective in a way, and that there would be those moments when some message would go viral, which does happen from time to time, but it's not always edifying free speech. It can be any number of silly, foolish activities that when that happens, or something very negative, as in the case, I think you mentioned a number of the conspiracy theories that are out there that are very much a part of this political campaign for the presidency.
I think in the early days, as there often is with relatively new technologies, there was a lot of naivete as to how the technology would actually work in practice. And we thought, okay, there are a few barriers to entry. There's this leveling impact where everybody's on the same plane, and you will have this paradise for free speech. And what quickly became apparent is that what gains traction on the web is not one, truth. Is not really among the things that gain traction very well. I mean, lies go much further than truth. Stuff that's outrageous gets you much more traction than stuff that's not outrageous. And it's a great medium for misinformation, because you don't have the kinds of monitors. Back when you had people rely for information on a few networks and maybe their local newspaper, or maybe a national newspaper, those places all had editors who were imbued with a certain set of principles. And
the magazines all had fact checkers.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
And major magazines all had that, and so you had a certain guarantee that what you were getting was not just something that somebody sitting in a corner had cooked up and thrown out into the ether. You don't have that guarantee on the internet. And so it's changed the way that we consume information in lots of ways, but it's also made traditional media, first of all, it's made them poorer because they have to compete for advertising dollars with things on the internet, and they're losing that battle more often than not. But it's also made them compete for eyes, for viewers, things like that. So the standards in media have changed. One small way that I noticed the change was when I was at Newsweek, when we went online, and the publication went online, and all of a sudden there was something that there had never been before, which was ranking of stories, and what was the most popular that day or that week in the magazine. And it's difficult not to be influenced by that. So instead of deciding what's most important to write about, what's in the back of a lot of people's minds now is what's going to get the most eyes, and that's not necessarily what's most important.
And yet we've had the recent example of the Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd incident, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, the city where this is being broadcast from tonight, that has had a profound impact across the country. We don't know the outcome of that yet, but That's something that just went viral and ended up, affecting every city and little town in the land where you see Black Lives Matter signs in little communities, and you would have never imagined this before.
Web is a mixed bag. It's a powerful force, and it can be a powerful force for good, as we saw initially with a number of the freedom movements, not just here, but overseas. But it can be a powerful source for bad as well, and particularly when you get into misinformation, or when it inspires people to go and kill people, as in Christchurch, or as in South Carolina, where you had a guy who murdered people in a church, apparently partly because of inspiration that he got online. It does all of this stuff. It's neutral and amoral in that sense. And so to see it just as a good is to only see part of what it does.
Ellis, you've written a provocative and powerful book, an important book, I think. What's your hope for the impact this book can have, the message that you're carrying in the book? You certainly give us the historical framework, which is necessary, and I think a strong diagnostic, and then a call to arms or call to action to do something about this. Do you then leave this enterprise with hopefulness, or are you somewhat in despair about what might happen next?
Both. I mean, I think that we are in really fraught times, and I won't even go into detail about that. But I think when we do have not just a candidate, but when we have a government, which in many ways you can't trust anymore, because lies have become endemic within the government structure itself. And when it comes to important things, that's a huge danger. I think when you have a government that has decided it's going to pronounce some states anarchist states, and then try to withhold funding from them on the basis of the kinds of speech that has been exercised in those states, that's scary stuff. But I also think that pendulums swing. I think that there will come a time when the Supreme Court revisits the decision that it made, in Citizens United, and there will come a time as a nation when we have to think about how much do we want to surrender our freedoms that we fought so hard to win.
Your epilogue really brings us up to date on the implications during this COVID-19 pandemic. Any thoughts about that?
Well, you ask about despair. I would say, close to despair when you think of how that was handled. But just the news of the last week, when it's become so transparent that the CDC, which is an icon of integrity, or had been under so many governments, is now being largely co-opted by political influence. You just find yourself wondering, where this can ultimately lead, and certainly nowhere good. And when you have a threshold, as we recently passed, where 200,000 people died, any number of them unnecessarily so, because of the misinformation and the misuse of information that has accompanied the way that we as a nation have dealt with this epidemic. You just say, okay, we can do better than this.
One would hope, yeah. I wonder if we should check with Annie to see if there are any questions that have come through. Very good.
So I think that you both have been you've taken us through the book in such a organized and thoughtful way. I think you've all anticipated sort of the questions. We've talked about how social media and big tech and even Citizens United, and even now we're going into the very, very immediate issues of the COVID-19 pandemic. So you have you've preempted any question I had while I was listening to this. It's been wonderful. So I think I will just say that, first of all, Ellis, can you hold the book up again? There it is. I just want to remind people that that book is available at majorsandquinn.com, which I did put a link in to the comments here. And it is also available in Majors and Quinn, the bookstore. We are open if you're in the Twin Cities area. We are open to limited browsing, noon to 7 daily. And don't forget your mask, but you can stop by, you can look at that book and others, and we would really love to see you. And I think just as a final question, Ellis, if someone were to buy and read your book, what would you recommend be the next thing they read?
Oh, well, that's easy. I recommend that they, after reading this book, they read Democracy If We Can Keep It, which is the definitive history of the ACLU, which I just happened to write.
Yeah, oh yes, and that was, Ev mentioned that at the beginning of the program, and I will find a link for that book on our website as well and put it in the comments.
Both excellent books, and Ellis's other books as well. In many ways, this is a wonderful segue back to your first book, Ellis, which was about the press, about the state media at that time, which has changed radically since then. But you were rather prescient about some of the impacts of large ownership on freedom of expression even then, and it's gotten more pronounced. But I think the seeds were there, and that was a great contribution, as is this one. It's really an honor for me to be part of this tonight and to wish you well in the I hope the long life of this book and the chances for it to be read by a lot of people. A lot of people are at home now. They're still social. They're still at home, and this is a great thing to stop and read this book. It's extremely well written, I would say, and it's a thoughtful book that will engage your family and other people in a continued conversation about one of the most important aspects of our democracy that is indeed in peril at the moment. So Ellis, thank you so much, and thanks for letting me be part of this.
Oh, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, F. So thank you.
Yeah, and thanks to both of you for being here on our platform. Thanks to everyone who was watching, and have a wonderful evening.